Whenever someone praises my work or whenever I get a note that says you inspired me, actually for me, inspiration is really important. So when I hear that, I stack those in my notes app. And whenever I have this moment where I feel like, am I really the right person to do that? Am I capable? I usually look at that.
Hey there, and welcome to the Career Flipper podcast. I'm Jenny Dempsey, your host and fellow career flipper. This podcast started because after getting laid off and questioning everything about my career, I couldn't stop wondering, how do people actually pull off these big career flips? And how do they keep going when things get messy and overwhelming and confusing? That curiosity led me here, having real, honest conversations with people from all kinds of backgrounds about how they navigated major career changes. So if someone sent you this episode, that's amazing because it means they believe in you and your career journey. So pop in your earbuds, get comfy, and let's dive into some career flipping inspiration. And hey, don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss a new episode every Thursday. Today, you'll meet Julie Hanell. Originally from Switzerland, she has lived all over the world, including South Africa, Spain, and France. Julie has done a little bit of everything. Graced magazine covers as a model. She opened and ran her own coffee shop in South Africa and launched a tech company for women to host events and swap clothing. She moved into talent acquisition in the tech world, and now she's head of growth for a global organization. Oh, and if that wasn't enough, she also is the co-host of the She Hustles podcast, a podcast all about helping female entrepreneurs take action and chase their dreams. In the episode, we get into all of it. How she makes these decisions to ensure that she doesn't regret anything. The times she had to start over and really knew it was for the best. Dealing with imposter syndrome, and how she's built a career and life that actually feels so right for her. Julie is full of wisdom, and she keeps it real about what it's like to navigate big career pivots with nothing holding her back. One quick note. This episode was recorded in late 2024, before I took on a full-time job, basically the investors to my dreams, in early 2025. So there's part in the episode that talks through this, so I thought I'd mention it for context. And my thoughts in the conversation haven't changed, but I just wanted to give you that little heads up. Anyways, Julie's story is so inspiring. I know you're going to love this chat. Let's get into it now. I am here with Julie today. Julie, thank you so much for being here with me on the Career Flipper.
Thank you for welcoming me. I'm super excited about our episode today.
Me too. You know, how we connected. If I remember correctly, there was a post about career changes, and someone tagged us or tagged me in the post and was like, you need to talk to her. And then we just connected right from there. And I mean, I love when that happens. I feel like it is serendipitous, and I'm so glad to have connected with you because your story is full of lots of ups and downs and lessons, and you just continue to show up and share it all. So tell everyone a little bit about you, where you're at and what you're doing now, and then we'll dive into all the juicy stuff.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. But you're 100% right. That's how we connected. So I've been sharing my story quite a bit on LinkedIn lately because writing is what I enjoy most. But yeah, my story is pretty wild. So today you're finding me in the south of Spain. I have a house in the Marbella area, and I work as a head of growth for an American company, a small tech startup, so to say. So I take care of everything that's sales related, growth. It's honestly one of the most fitting job ever because it's head of growth. And I feel like all my career flips have given me, the space to grow. But do you want me to go all the way back, or what do you want to focus on?
Good question. If you could talk a little bit about the way back, I would love to have that foundation for everyone listening, because I know a little bit of it, But I think, as you just mentioned, those pieces are kind of like, I don't know, cookie crumbs or breadcrumbs in a way to where you are now. So if you're comfortable with that, I'd love to have you share.
Yeah. I'm very happy to share my story. I think I will then go way back. So maybe just for some context, today I'm 33 and I'm going all the way back to 18 because unlike most people, I never studied. So I was scouted to be a model when I was around 17 in Switzerland, a very small country in Europe. And so what happened was that suddenly afterwards, I got kind of thrown around Europe. So I lived in between Paris, Greece, Athens, Milan. I got to model. And then I had a job in South Africa, Cape Town, when I was 18. And I just fell in love with the place. And for those who have been in the modeling industry, I'm pretty sure you know it's a pretty, tough kind of industry to work in. Lots of lessons for sure that are still useful today, which I'll get on later. But yeah, I suddenly realized, oh my gosh, like I don't want to be a model for the rest of my life. That wasn't my dream to be the next Cindy Crawford or, Gisele Bündchen. So I realized that in South Africa, the money I'd made in Europe would give me enough to open a cafe. So I was 19 and I opened a cafe. That was my dream. And that's the beauty of being extremely naive and young and no responsibilities and feel like you can do anything. And ultimately I did. So I opened a cafe called The Blend. That went amazingly well. We did top 5, 2 years in a row. And then one day a couple from London knocked on my door and they were like, we really want to buy your cafe. And I was like, what? Really? You do? So that was really fun. I sold the cafe, I trained them, and then I realized that I wanted to travel again because when you have a cafe, you very much, stuck on site. You have to make sure everything runs smoothly and so on. So I opened, I would say, the very first net-a-porter, but for South Africa. So women could basically sell their secondhand, high-end garments. I also organized sip and swap parties where women could come with their garments and then kind of, have wine because we had a lot of wine and champagne sponsors and then, shop and also swap clothing. And then after that, I opened a few branches around South Africa and I sold that when I was 24. And then I was like, okay, what's next? Went back to Switzerland, did some thinking, some recentering, and I realized law, anything that's legal, contracts, agreements, and then recruitment are the 2 major pain points of having a business. And I was like, okay, I'm 24. I really need to learn about that. So then I joined a big multinational executive search company, and that's what I did for a long time. So I really, nerded into understanding people. How do they work? What motivates them? How do you pay them? All of that. How do you create a team that's powerful? And so I did that for a while. I was back in Switzerland. I also studied law at a distance. I did that for a while, and then I was like, this is not for me. So I gave up. So I dropped out. And then moving on to recruiting, I also moved to Stockholm at the same time because I am married to a Swede and I realized I wanted to be in Sweden. And that is where I fell into tech recruitment. So ever since I've been in the tech industry, mainly recruitment, talent acquisition, management. Then I founded a startup, a virtual reality startup during the pandemic, which was really fun, fundraised some money, and then left that startup because the pandemic, we had, some team members that were going through divorces and really, heavy personal issues. So I decided to just move on. And today I'm head of growth. So that's my journey so far. So it's been so people, do not lose hope. If you think you have a nonlinear career, please.
Yeah. I mean, from where you began with something that you didn't really even want to do. And then you did it, and it taught you a lot about the things that it sounds like you really did enjoy, like connecting with people and travel. And then you realize the parts that you didn't enjoy, and you weren't afraid to make a switch. And I think, and maybe this is different for everybody, but I hear a lot from people when you get success, when you're in a successful role, for example, I'm just going to jump back to the first one, modeling. You're
Go ahead.
clearly very successful and, making money to support yourself. And it sounds like at that point, you're like, I didn't want to do this anymore. And people get to this point where they're like, I don't want to do this anymore. But when it comes to the financial part, you have the stability, you have this certain way of life. To just say no and give that up is really frightening. It's scary. It's a lot of unknowns. So I'm curious, and you were so young. You were just a baby. How did you know? I guess, and maybe that's also why you're able to maybe take more risks when we're a little younger. But I'm curious, what was going through your mind at that point about financial security and how you were able to be okay with like, I'm not going to do this, but I want to open this coffee or this, this cafe because this is what makes sense. How did that become a safe, I guess, or calculated risk? Maybe I should call it for you at that point.
That is such a brilliant question. So, and, I need to think because I've never been asked this question. So this is exciting. I have always been not impulsive, but I've always been very hungry as to, how can I better myself? How can I have an exciting life? For those who know Switzerland, it's quite a small place. The city I grew up is like a small town in America. Everyone does the same thing. Children are expected to become lawyers, doctors, if they make it, through studies. And so I was always very, I think, hungry for a world outside of Switzerland. And so when I went to South Africa, I really fell in love with the place, and the connections I'd made with the people down there were so strong that I felt like this is another home. When you're modeling and you're traveling, there are a few components that make life really hard, which is number one, you think that the girls modeling with you are friends, but most of the time they are absolutely horrible towards you. And that makes sense because everyone needs to make money, but competition levels are so high that you realize, okay, well, if she's going to the same casting as me, I should either run to that casting or I should lock her up in the bedroom. And that has happened to me. I've been locked up in my bedroom. So, but I've also made some incredible friendships through modeling, girls, and I'm saying girls because we were really girls back then. And we were trying to figure out the world. And then you have your agencies, and agents, a lot of them are pretty horrible as well. So I think in that sense, I had maybe some financial stability and I had a future, but it wasn't, enough of a trade-off for me to be like, let's not take the risk to actually bet everything on myself.
That makes sense. That sounds really hard.
I know.
Staying is scarier than leaving.
Exactly.
And you made that choice based on it. Yeah, it sounds like it's just that would just be so hard on like your mental health. Like, I mean, and so you made that leap and you got the cafe and it was thriving. It was thriving and it was keeping you in a place that it sounds like really became a home. And I'm guessing lots of regular people coming in. You got to know the community and then that couple from London came and knocked on your door. And at that moment, it sounds like you were just kind of itching to get back out and traveling. But what, kind of the same question, like not knowing what was next, so to say, what really prompted you to feel comfortable and, again, a calculated risk or safe or whatever word you want to call it, to make that decision like, yep, these are the people that are going to do a great job. Like, how did you know that at that point?
Yeah, again, I think for me, as we've discussed a little bit before, before recording, I've always been very curious. And the beauty of having your own cafe is that you get to meet a lot of people, and I love asking questions. So, I started seeing regulars, talking with them, especially women, and they were all complaining about the same thing. Like, oh, I can't find a nice dress. Like, we're very restricted in terms of fashion brands. Some women were like, I have some amazing stuff that I don't know what to do with it because there's no really, places to go with. And that's where, browsing the internet, I realized, oh my gosh, we don't have anything like net-à-porter. And I think being as naive as I was back then, I was like, that's it. That's what I'm supposed to do. I have a background in fashion. I'm really interested by, using tech and seeing what can be done. And then I think like most digital nomads, I had this dream of like, can you imagine if I can run my business from the US, but in South Africa? So I was very tempted. And I must say, having a cafe for 2.5 years, you're on your feet every single day. I mean, it's South Africa, so there's a lot of like, it's quite a dangerous place. It was back then. It's an amazing place, but there's still like a lot of, instability and so on. And I think I was just really ready to move on and do something new and test myself.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. And the breadcrumbs from things in the past coming to fruition where you're like, I want this and I can use these skills that I've learned along the way to make these other things happen. I love that about you. You're not afraid to take risks and you're really using the skills from a very technical level, but also a very intuitive level. You're able to really tune into who you are. And I think, gosh, I don't think I really knew myself that well in my early 20s. I just was kind of like jumping around and thinking that this path was going to be carved out for me because this is what everyone told me to do. Go to college, get a job. That's what you do. So I didn't know how to question it. I don't think I even, and a lot of the times don't think I felt that I could do anything different. I didn't feel permission to be able to do that. And it sounds like for you, you didn't want permission. You just gave it to yourself because you're like, I want to do this. I want to do this. And I really admire that about you. And I think everyone listening will really get that full picture of like, you don't have to wait for the permission. You can give it to yourself. You don't have to wait for someone to come up and validate that your idea is great. You can just try and see if it's going to work out.
When you have support at home and you kind of have good friends around and people are going to study, I don't think there's enough space for you, as a teenager or young adult to actually question really what do you want. And also there's so much, I mean, I did a lot of different things and still today, sometimes I ask myself, who am I really? And I'm, now I think I have a good idea, especially after, being in this job now for 2.5 years, I really understand my skills. But yeah, you can't be too hard on yourself. And again, I know this is a bit of a different conversation, but in Europe, there's an understanding for gap years. As when I think of Americans and when I exchange with you guys, it's not really allowed because you want to have the CV in order to enter big companies. So, it's I don't think we can be too hard on ourselves. A lot of the time, our past is sometimes defined by where we live, and we have to just make do.
Right. That is a really good point. It is not welcomed here, just like working and taking vacation time is, as much as people are kind of coming around to it, I think more now it's still a little like, oh, you're taking that time off. It is different culture-wise. Mm-hmm. So that is really good to bring that up because we are working in the constraints of something that is way beyond us. And when we make decisions to go against that, there's a lot that comes with it. And we just have to still accept that and still keep moving forward. So yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because that is something that's important. It's really important when you're thinking about changing your career. It comes into play for sure.
Absolutely.
Once you sold that and then, going back to like I'm just going to call it sustainable clothing. Love me a thrift store. That is basically where most of my clothes come from. I am very into sustainable fashion. I wouldn't say I'm fashionable but I like sustainable. I probably have a lot to learn from you on the fashion front. But anyways, that's another side conversation. But you took something that there was a gap. There was not really an option for women to either clear things out of their closet that were valuable and very, fashion forward, but also to find new pieces. And so you took that gap and then you took your tech skills and you created was it a platform? Can you talk a little bit more about what you built and how that led into your next chapter?
Absolutely. So I didn't have any tech skills back then, but I had a bit of a fashion understanding due to living in Paris for a while. And so I got in touch with a small team that developed websites, and I basically sat along with them most days to understand how we build this out. And it was a platform where you could log in, have your own account, and then you could upload pictures of your items, and then you could, meet up with other women in order to swap those items. However, being South Africa, women didn't want to meet at a random place because it was way too dangerous to just, So I realized, okay, well, now I need to pivot somehow. So what we did was we had a whole list of restaurants, cafe, boutiques that were, verified by our brand where women could actually meet. And then I started those monthly sip and swap parties. So I had champagne houses, wine houses, some fashion boutiques that would sponsor me. I would rent out a big space, and then all of those boutiques and sponsors had their stands. And then women would bring up to 5 garments that they could swap. And that's how it took off. And that was really fantastic. It was a lot of fun. So it was more of an events company with, a platform, but ultimately it was a lot of fun.
That sounds like so much fun. I 100% would love, like, I would love that. That sounds like a blast.
Yeah.
And so then you're bringing people together. This community aspect is really falling into place here, which sounds very aligned with who I know you as now. Like you are a community builder. And so here it is really, maybe at the cafe it also started, but I'm really hearing it more now. And so then when you decided to pivot from that, was that hard to kind of, because with that community that you were building, and again, in a place that felt like home, was it hard to pivot and get back out and travel? Or were you at this point where you're like, I'm ready, like I need to change? Like where were you feeling at that point?
Yeah, I was definitely ready to change. I think I realized I was hitting a ceiling. So what happened is those events took off, and then I welcomed 2 women on the team. They each had their own branch or franchise, and then they carried on with it. And eventually I just realized, I had this idea, and I think that happens a lot actually when you're pivoting, because you can only do so much research until you're actually in the job, right? So you have this idea of, having the net-a-porter of South Africa with 20 million women logged in. And I think that's when impatience kicked in. I was 24 and I felt like, oh my gosh, I'm soon 25. I'm not a millionaire yet. And so I just thought I need to go. And on a personal level, I had some hardships in South Africa where I had a few pretty bad situations where my life was endangered. And so that, some actually a gun to my head yes. And so technically I realized maybe it's time to go back to Switzerland, and there were a lot of things politically I wasn't, really fine with in South Africa. I mean, there were a lot of things that started building up. That is also at that time, Nelson Mandela passed. So you could feel spiritually that things were not going well. So luckily being Swiss, I could, leave. So I left and went back to Switzerland, and I'm very quick I'm very quick at making decisions. I think that's one of the qualities I have. I don't really ponder, over what has been. I'm more like, okay, what's next?
How do you make those decisions, especially big decisions, with like that lightning speed? What goes through your mind? What's your process? I'm going to be taking
notes. I'm curious though, when I hear you, say you're ruminating and so on, how long does it take for you in general, if you look back at your process? How many days or months or, does it take before you actually make the decision?
That's a good question. I'll use the podcast as an example because this is the most recent one. It took me over 3 months to make the decision to actually do it. And what was going through my mind initially was like, I'm not good enough to do something like that. Who am I to do something like that? I've never done anything like that. I don't know how. And that was just like the record that kept playing. But then the reason why this question is so good and going back to the, lightning decisions, there was a pivot point where I actually got my 350th job rejection. And I suddenly was like, I don't care. I don't care if I don't know. I don't care if I won't be good at it. I have to do this because I don't care anymore. And it was getting to the point of not caring what anyone else thinks or even what I think of myself and just thinking that I'm so drawn to this, I'm just going to frickin' do it. But it does take me a while sometimes to get to that. And, for better or worse, that's progress, not perfection, right?
No, but when I hear you, this is what I'm thinking. There's a few things that come up because number one, when you're pivoting, you always have imposter syndrome. I've had it in every single job, literally. And so what I've come to do now is whenever someone praises my work or whenever I get a note that says you inspired me, actually for me, inspiration is really important. So when I hear that, I stack those in my notes app. And whenever I have this moment where I feel like, am I really the right person to do that? Am I capable? I usually look at that. And then the second thing I would say, and I've always functioned this way, but that's mainly because of my childhood, but I've always been extremely scared of having regrets. And I would say all of my decisions, it's been this one question. When you're 65 and looking back, will you regret doing this? And honestly, it's that question is always there. And so I would say the last hardest decision I made was to quit the startup I had co-founded and fundraised for. And that was really hard. I, again, had this dream. Okay, I'm going to do 10 years in this startup. It's going to be a unicorn. It's going to be a big thing. Then I can retire and invest in other startups and support people. And after, 1 year after fundraising, nothing happened. And I was like, okay, what are the different scenarios? And that's what I did. Literally, I took an entire week and I listed all the various scenarios. And today we can do that with ChatGPT.
That's true.
But I listed all those scenarios and I was like, what, is any of those scenarios appealing to me if I stay versus is there any of those, are those scenarios if I leave more appealing? And it so happened and leaving was the most appealing part to me because I wanted to do new things. So I've definitely changed. The Julie who was asking about regrets at 19 is not the same at 33, but it's still a question I ask myself. I'm really super scared of having regrets, very, very scared. So that tells you a bit about me.
Yeah. And that's a great point because, picturing yourself older and looking back to live a life that you're suddenly like, yeah, I wish I would have done that. And then not have those opportunities as easily accessible. Age doesn't always get in everyone's way, but it can be harder sometimes to start things when, you're a little bit past, a certain age. And so I think it's a great thing to have. I feel like I would write that on a Post-it note, put it on my computer, and every time I'm thinking about things, because having those regrets holds you back. It's kind of sad. And I know you and talking about other things before, like the story of my dad and and when he was on his deathbed and I wish I would have, gotten to know you and your sister better. I wish I would have worked less. Things like that, to have a regret on your deathbed of things that you could have done and relationships you could have had. I don't want to be that person either.
No.
So that makes sense. And I love that you bring that to the table to open other people's eyes too, because it is hard to make decisions, especially big decisions when it comes to things that could impact you financially. But knowing that if it's a matter of you regretting it down the road, it just it doesn't seem like it's worth it. The cost is more to not do it than to do it and be struggling a little bit, or a lot of it, like however that works. Yeah.
I agree. And on that note, I don't want this to become a decision-making podcast episode,
No.
but I need to say something else. I listen to, obviously, I listen to tech podcasts every week, and there was this podcast about Bezos at Amazon, how he makes decisions. And I think he has a very simple model that we can all learn from, which is think of certain decisions as being reversible and others irreversible. In other words, if you decide to say yes to this opportunity, is that something that will get you in a different space that you can never come back from? Or is that something you can actually change, turn around to get back to something different? And so obviously with irreversible decisions, it should be much easier to say yes than no. Maybe it helps, but it helped me. So I thought I'd share.
That does. It makes it feel safer.
Exactly.
And I think also, again, not to turn this into decision making, I'll pivot in a second. But one thing that popped in my mind when you said that is like, there comes this point where you think you cannot go back once you've made a choice, but we put these restraints on ourselves. And so when we kind of remove that and think, I can go back, or I can change, or I can move, or I could, do something different, then we become more open to making those decisions on a regular basis. And even with little things like the furniture flipping that I do, like sometimes, I'm not sure about reaching out to a business or reaching out to some potential client, like even little decisions in the day to day. Sometimes I just have to think, well, what's the worst they could say? No. Cool.
Exactly.
If they know, I'm going to talk to someone else, and putting it into a perspective that my mind is not going to be locked in. This is the one no that's going to be the end all. It's not the end all. There's more opportunities out there. You just sometimes got to look for them in other places. But yeah, I really love that you talked about this. I love that we expanded on it a bit, because decision making is such a big part of changing your career, and it can be what holds people back because they're putting those restraints on themselves. And you've clearly made a lot of decisions. You have a lot of expertise in that, at least in my opinion. So thanks for diving into that with me. And so you made then, after that, for your safety, for your health and well-being, but also for your desire to want to be somewhere else. And you made another decision. You went back to Switzerland, and then, you found a new path. You carved that out. You learned what you needed to learn. And then you continued to move forward. And it sounds like at that point, finding a job was where you were landing. So can you talk about going from this position of like, you're working on your own, you're building things up for yourself, and then you go to work for someone else. What's that? Because that's kind of like the next few steps. Like, what has that been like? And how do you kind of like still give yourself the time and space to run your own things, like your personal branding and, education that you do outside of that while working for someone else? How does that kind of fit in with your entrepreneurial, mindset and spirit?
Yeah, it was really hard. I think it was one of the hardest pivots for me, for sure, because it's going from having a lot of freedom and dabbling into a lot of different things to being constrained in learning one specific craft and, also reporting to someone. Luckily, the person who hired me was very much an entrepreneur himself. And I think that is where, my thirst for learning was really satisfied, because he took me under his wing and he taught me everything in the business itself. He understood, But before that, though, oh my gosh, it was really tough. When I came back to Switzerland, I had some, savings on the side. But remember, the South African rand versus the Swiss franc was peanuts. So I didn't make a tech exit. So anyways, I had a little in my name. And the first job I took was wrapping gifts in a mall during Christmas. And that was that was a big blow to my ego, because you're in a place where you have those businesses, people know you as an entrepreneur, and then you come to Switzerland and you're wrapping those gifts. And I was like, this is weird. This feels odd. But I also realized you gotta, you're rebuilding from scratch. You're a whole new network. I was in a place where entrepreneurship wasn't understood, like the US. People were like, what did you do in South Africa? Like, what happened? Were you like in love with someone? Like, why would you do this to yourself? And then I also applied to quite a few jobs, and people were like, you don't have a degree, I'm not going to hire you. You have 0 degrees. So luckily, I think modeling and having a business taught me, personal branding. I knew how to sell myself. And that is one skill I think anyone who's wanting to pivot needs to learn. Like, doesn't have to be, LinkedIn posting, but it has to be like, okay, what am I bringing to the table? Who am I as a person? How can I sell those skills? Like, how do I read a job description where I see gaps that, my skills could really benefit them for the growth or that department? And I think that is where, I really managed. I had that one interview that was given to me after that entrepreneur saw some potential. But yeah, it was really tough. And for a lot of years without a degree, people were like, oh, well, yeah, but you have the potential. You don't understand how much I hate potential. Like, you know what I mean?
Because you're like, I've done it. I don't just have the potential. I have it. Like, I know this. And through experience. And that sometimes, I mean, not to diss anyone's education, but sometimes experience can be very much a greater teacher. And so I hear you on that. Yeah.
Absolutely. 100%. And the thing is, we're not speaking about, being a doctor or defending, a case. It's like, that wasn't the job. Job was recruiting, learning how to recruit. And I think like being a student, learning human resources, but I had actually, real life experience. I had to hire people for the 2 companies I had built. And so those were probably not the best people. It was best technique, but I had some type of experience. So I think, learning to sell yourself, mainly learning to sell your skills and show the person who is interviewing you that you have a lot more to offer than actually just the job description. Is really a plus. But that was tough.
Yeah, that sounds really tough. Like, just to continue to get knocked down, and then you just got to pull yourself back up and be like, no, I got this. And you had the confidence, or maybe even moments when you didn't have the confidence, you still kept getting up and being like, no, this is who I am. This is what I can bring, and I am going to do it amazing. And that continued to show up, because that can really knock someone's spirit down. That can really that's exhausting. And at some points, it's just like so hard on your self-esteem. And it's just hard. Like, so I'm guessing though, because the other thing I hear a lot from other people who flip their careers is the supportive network that we have around us of people that are cheering us on. So can you talk a little bit more about, because, let's say people are knocking you down and calling it, you have potential, but who's telling you, you got this? Who outside of those people, like what was your network of supportive people like for you at that time?
Not much, because I had, I'd obviously lost a lot of friends moving to, modeling, and then coming back from South Africa, I left, I didn't wait 3 months before leaving. I kind of packed everything up and then left. Mm-hmm. So my main support was basically my mom who kept telling me, you decided to go live abroad at 19 and you went through so many things, and yet you are discouraged by some white dude who's not wanting to give you a job. She managed to pick me up it wasn't a loving, it was a loving way, but it wasn't the soft, super kind. It was just like, stop being stupid, literally. And I think definitely it fired me up. I had this, need to prove, and I had all my paper clips from the newspapers in South Africa and magazines when my companies were mentioned. So it was just a matter of, I guess, adapting. And ultimately, when you join a company, it's about learning how to play the game. And I think that is really hard when you're an entrepreneur, because you set the rules, but then suddenly you're in a place where the rules are given to you.
That can feel very constraining.
Yeah.
And you got to play inside those walls. And when your mind thinks bigger and you color outside the lines, in most other situations, that's just, it can feel like your creativity is just kind of being strangled in a way. And that's hard.
But let me ask you, I mean, you have lived the entrepreneurial journey now. So it's we on the opposite, right? So you started corporate and now you're entrepreneur. How, like, if someone came to you and said, here's a job offer, what would you say?
Well, that it's so interesting to put into that. And I will, before I answer that question, I will say that, like, the thing I've learned in corporate along the way was creating so much structure and process. And so I take all of that, and in all of the stuff that I am building, there is probably too much process, structure. Like, I'm still looking to create it, but I'm creating it for myself. And that has just been very interesting, because then if I want to change it, I don't have to wait for it to get approved. I'm just going to go in there and change it and be like, all right, we're going to do this now. We're going to pivot. And that feels really good. Whether or not it works, because I don't have someone being like, well, your bonus depended on this and it didn't work. I'm like, well, I'm just going to figure it out. And so if someone came and presented me a job, and to be honest, because I'm still, a couple years into this, I'm still learning. And when you start new things, especially things like furniture flipping, which doesn't have a very, early on, that you're building a brand, people are getting to know you and trust you. And I'm in a very small market right now.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes it doesn't make a lot of money. And the podcast itself as well, people have to learn to trust you before you can bring on, different types of revenue streams. And so that being said, money still needs to come in from someplace. And I don't talk about this much, so I'm glad you're bringing this up, because there is a part of me that sometimes feels like I should, in air quotes, I'm telling myself the shoulds, which are not necessarily valid. I should be making money on these things, but I'm just not there yet. And so if someone presented me with a job that fit into my schedule, that offered me flexibility to do it part-time, and it paid, I would absolutely take it. If that is what is going to pay the bills and fund my dream. It may not be forever. It may not be something that I'm pouring all of my heart and soul in, but I think that it is absolutely okay for people, if they want something to come to fruition, to look for a job that's just going to pay the bills. But I also have very high standards. Like, it's not going to be a toxic environment. I'm not going to be, unable to take vacation time. I'm not going to, settle for being talked down. I feel like it needs to I still just have really high expectations of a great work culture, of a great, product that I want to support, something that I know. So my expectations are just very high. But I think the entrepreneurial journey, sometimes you just have to get creative with how you're going to bring in money to pay the bills to continue to make the dream happen, because it doesn't happen overnight, and it's not always successful right away. And that's okay.
Brilliantly said. I think you brought up such an important point as well, where so many people nowadays have this, idea of it's all, all white, all black, like there's no gray area. And I think the magic of a full-time job, or a job in general, is that you have maybe a bit more, mental freedom to dedicate to either hobbies or a dream that you want to build. And, I think you need to have respect for those choices as well. You not being a full-time entrepreneur, for example, doesn't mean that you aren't an entrepreneur. I very much feel like an entrepreneur within my job, and, with the podcast that I have as well with Julia. So it's nowadays, I feel like there's massive flexibility to really create a life for yourself. you just have to be picky and you have to know yourself. I think most of us don't really know who we are and what we really need and what fits us. And that's part of the journey. And I feel like that's where you are right now. It's like, okay, you've understood that if you're going to take a job, it has to maybe be part-time. It has to have, certain criteria. And most likely, you'll get that job offered because the clearer you get about it, that the easier it is to call it.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's no shame in that. There's no shame in creating what you need in the moment. And going back to what we were talking about before, that it can change. I love that. And I want to talk about something else really quick, not to change the subject, but you brought up your podcast. And we were talking about personal branding, and we're talking about carving your own path and really doing things also, this entrepreneurial journey and doing things outside of our full-time jobs, because a lot of people listening are having those jobs and just think, oh, I don't have time to do anything else outside. Or, I think about this business or this podcast or writing this, and they don't start these things. And you have. So can you share a little bit more about your podcast and talk about how that came to be?
Yes. So the podcast is very much about starting businesses, the hardships of actually getting started. It's not only businesses, actually, it's also side hustles, hobbies. To your point, a lot of people are thinking about how do I just get started? And a lot of people stay stuck in the strategizing, the thinking. And so we had this idea with one of my best friends, Julia, to just start this podcast called She Hustles in order to help our girlfriends who are thinking of starting something to get started. And so it's mainly, a podcast where both of us are speaking about our experience. She has her own business in social media and personal branding, and she's 24. So we have a nice age gap, which makes for really interesting conversations because I promise you, her view of what the job, life is about or corporate world is very different from mine, which I think is fun to talk about. And so I think in general, yes, there aren't that many hours in a day. And, some of us have a lot of responsibilities. Some of us have children. I do not. So I also think, that makes up for huge amounts of time that I can dedicate to my, side hustles and passions. But ultimately, again, it comes back to the regret piece. Like, I want to feel stimulated. I want to be in environments where I meet people like you, where I can talk about everything and anything and come out and be like, wow, I've actually learned something today. I can, go ahead and try that. And that is, it also comes down to values. Those are some of my values, learning and growing and, feeling stimulated and meeting incredible people. And I think you picked that up at the beginning. Like, I am very much about community. I have friends all around the world and we voice note every day and we, chat, but ultimately they're my community and I need that. And I feel very bored if I don't have it. And boredom is death for me. So to be very, very aggressive.
I can sense that. Yeah. It's like you. Also, can we talk about how, like, the power of voice notes? My girlfriends and I send those as well all day, and just continue to chat. You pick up when you have time, and they listen when they have time. They are the best. It's definitely, and actually, maybe this is something that I heard in one of your episodes. The accountability of that, like having an accountability buddy to be able to send a voice note to about something you're working on.
Yes.
And then get feedback no matter where they live in the world, no matter what time zone they're in. Like, thanks, WhatsApp, like, for giving us the ability to connect with people anywhere and everywhere and share ideas and support one another. And you not only do that, but then you created a podcast to, like, really amplify these things that people are learning and actually doing things about. They're carving their own path and getting the inspiration they need. And that's an incredible gift that you're bringing.
Thank you so much, Jenny. Well, I can say the same for your podcast.
Well, thank you. That means a lot. I am definitely honored to be in a situation where I can bring this out. And I want people to connect with you, Julie. I feel like you just have so much wisdom, so much that you pour into everything. And how can people find you? Where can they connect with you? How can they learn from you? All the good things. Share everything.
Yes. So the place where I'm most at is LinkedIn. They can connect with me. My first name is Julie and then Hanell. And then our podcast is She Hustles Podcast on Instagram. And we have a YouTube channel and we obviously on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and so on. So those are the main places.
Amazing. Thank you so much for taking the time, for being here with me today and sharing this. It's so wonderful to connect with you. Thank you so much, Julie.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of The Career Flipper. To connect with Julie, be sure to check out the show notes. If today's story really clicked with you, or if you know someone who's trying to figure out their own career change, do them a favor and share this episode with them. It could be exactly what they need to hear to keep trying, even when it gets really tough. Also, if you ever want to just share more about you or your friend's career flip, tell me about it. I want to know and talk more. Visit thecareerflipper.com to learn how to be part of a future episode. And remember, every teeny, tiny, itty bitty step counts. It may not feel like it in the moment, but it really does. You'll see. What's the best that could happen?